press briefing room in Washington, D.C. was filled to capacity, the usual hum of quiet conversations and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards forming the backdrop of yet another highly anticipated session. A row of cameras lined the back wall, their lenses fixed unwaveringly on the podium where Karoline Leavitt stood, poised and composed, her hands resting lightly on the podium as she prepared to address the gathered journalists. She had done this many times before, answering tough questions with confidence and navigating the unpredictable nature of press conferences with a level head. Yet today, something felt different. There was a weight in the air, a kind of unspoken tension that hummed just beneath the surface, as if everyone in the room was anticipating something more than just another policy discussion. The faces of the reporters reflected that expectation. Some leaned forward eagerly, others exchanged quick glances, as if silently acknowledging that the energy in the room was different from previous briefings. Karoline adjusted the microphone slightly, her expression betraying nothing but professionalism. "Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started," she said smoothly, her voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. Immediately, hands shot up across the room, journalists eager to get their questions in first. The press briefing began as usual, with Karoline fielding questions about the administration's latest policies, answering with the kind of well-rehearsed precision that came with her position. A reporter from a major network asked about tax cuts. Karoline responded fluidly, articulating the administration's stance with clarity. Another question followed, this time about education reform. Again, she handled it with ease, addressing concerns and reinforcing key points without hesitation. It was routine, professional, expected. But beneath the surface, there was a growing sense of anticipation, as though the usual rhythm of questions and answers was merely setting the stage for something bigger. Then it happened. A voice cut through the air, sharper than the rest, its tone carrying a different weight, one that wasn't just seeking information, but challenging it outright. "Miss Leavitt, let's talk about the real issue here." The shift was immediate. A few heads turned even before the question was fully spoken, recognizing the voice before they even saw her face. It was her, the liberal reporter Karoline knew all too well. Always aggressive, always pushing the conversation toward controversy, she sat near the front, leaning forward slightly with a smirk, pen tapping rhythmically against her notepad. Karoline remained composed, her expression giving away nothing. "Go ahead," she said simply, knowing full well that whatever came next would not be an ordinary question. The reporter wasted no time. "Do you think the administration's policies are intentionally designed to suppress certain communities? Because the data suggests—" Karoline lifted a hand before the question could be completed. "I've answered that question before," she said evenly. "The administration is focused on policies that benefit all Americans, regardless of background. If you'd like to discuss the specifics of today's topic, I'm happy to continue." A few murmurs rippled through the room, a subtle but clear acknowledgement that Karoline had chosen to deflect the question without engaging in controversy. The tension in the room, however, only thickened. The reporter was unfazed. She leaned in slightly, pressing forward with a tone that was now bordering on insistence. "You didn't actually answer the question, though," she said, her smirk widening just slightly. "Can you directly address whether—" Karoline cut her off, her voice firm but still controlled. "I did answer," she stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. She glanced at the other journalists in the room, signaling that she was ready to move on. For a moment, it seemed like the situation might return to normal, that the briefing could continue as planned. But then the reporter spoke again, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. "I just don't see why you're avoiding it." The temperature in the room shifted. The dynamic of the briefing had officially changed. Other reporters exchanged glances, some intrigued, others visibly uncomfortable. No one liked when a press conference turned into a showdown, but it was clear that was exactly what was happening. Karoline exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in measured control. "I'm not avoiding anything," she replied. "I'm staying on topic. If you have a question related to today's discussion, I'll gladly answer it. If not, I'll be moving on." The reporter didn't back down. She leaned even closer to the microphone. "So that's a no comment?" The energy in the room tightened, the weight of the moment settling on everyone's shoulders. It was clear this was no longer about seeking answers. It was about control, about shifting the narrative. A hush fell over the room. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was waiting, coiled like an elastic band, stretched just before it snapped. Reporters who had initially been neutral observers were now part of the moment, their pens hovering over notebooks, their eyes flickering between Karoline and the reporter, waiting to see who would hold their ground. Karoline adjusted her stance slightly, both hands now firmly on the podium. "I've answered your question," she said once more, her voice measured but unwavering. "I'll be moving on now." She pointed to another journalist in the back, someone who had been waiting to ask a question. For a brief second, it seemed like she had successfully reclaimed control of the room. But before the new journalist could even speak, the same voice cut through again, sharp, relentless. "Why is it so hard for you to give a straight answer?" A flicker of irritation crossed Karoline's face. Not much, just a brief tightening around the eyes, but enough for those paying attention to catch it. She wasn't new to this game. She understood how the press worked. She knew reporters had a job to do, that tough questions were part of the process. But there was a difference between pressing for accountability and turning an event into a personal performance. And right now it was clear which one this was. The air in the room had shifted completely, no longer a standard press briefing, but a moment on the verge of spiraling into something bigger, something that would not be contained within the walls of this room. The cameras panned slightly, now focused not just on Karoline, but on the reporter as well, capturing every glance, every movement, every subtle shift in power. This was no longer just about policy, it was about control, and neither side was willing to back down. The moment the reporter's voice cut through the room, the atmosphere shifted, the usual rhythm of questions and answers breaking under the weight of what was about to unfold. Karoline Leavitt had anticipated tough inquiries, as she always did, but there was something different in the way this one was delivered. The reporter, known for her aggressive tactics and pointed questioning, had seized the moment, her voice carrying not just curiosity, but a clear intent to challenge and provoke. "Ms. Leavitt, let's talk about the real issue here," she began, leaning forward, her smirk barely concealed. Her posture, the calculated rhythm of her pen tapping against the notepad, and the sharpness of her tone all signaled one thing. This was not just about getting an answer, it was about making a point, about shifting the focus of the briefing to suit her agenda. Karoline remained composed, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. "Go ahead," she said, her voice neutral, her expression unreadable. The reporter wasted no time. "Do you think the administration's policies are intentionally designed to suppress certain communities? Because the data suggests—" Karoline raised a hand, cutting her off before she could finish. "I've answered that question before," she said, her tone firm but calm. "The administration is focused on policies that benefit all Americans, regardless of background. If you'd like to discuss the specifics of today's topic, I'm happy to continue." There was a flicker of tension in the room, a few murmurs rippling through the crowd of journalists. Some exchanged glances, sensing the shift in energy, recognizing that this was no longer a simple policy question. It was something bigger, something charged with the potential to turn the briefing into a battleground. The reporter, unfazed, leaned in even closer. "You didn't actually answer the question, though," she pressed, her voice edged with defiance. "Can you directly address whether—" "I did answer," Karoline interrupted, her tone steady but carrying a finality that signaled she was not going to be dragged into a back and forth. She shifted her gaze away from the reporter, looking toward the other journalists, silently indicating that she was ready to move on. A brief pause followed, a moment where it seemed like she had successfully diffused the tension, steering the briefing back toward its intended direction. But then the reporter spoke again, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. "I just don't see why you're avoiding it," she said, her words hanging in the room, loaded with insinuation. The temperature seemed to drop slightly. Other reporters shifted in their seats, their pens hovering above their notepads, waiting to see what would happen next. Some looked intrigued, others uncomfortable. No one liked a press briefing turning into a spectacle. But that was exactly what was unfolding. Karoline exhaled slowly, a measured breath meant to keep her composure intact. "I'm not avoiding anything," she said, her voice even, deliberate. "I'm staying on topic. If you have a question related to today's discussion, I'll gladly answer it. If not, I'll be moving on." But the reporter wasn't backing down. She leaned in further, her posture aggressive, her smirk unwavering. "So that's a no comment?" The energy in the room tightened. Every journalist in the room could feel it now, the moment shifting from an ordinary press exchange to something that would undoubtedly make headlines. The silence wasn't passive, it was waiting, the kind that coils just before snapping. Karoline adjusted her stance slightly, squaring her shoulders, both hands resting firmly on the podium. "I've answered your question," she stated once more, her voice unwavering. "I'll be moving on now." She pointed to another journalist toward the back, someone who had been waiting patiently for their turn to speak. But before they could even open their mouth, the same voice cut through again, relentless. "Why is it so hard for you to give a straight answer?" A flicker of something, annoyance, impatience, or perhaps just sheer exhaustion, passed across Karoline's face. It was brief, barely noticeable to those not paying close attention, but it was there. She wasn't new to this. She had dealt with difficult reporters before. She understood that part of the job was facing scrutiny, answering tough questions, holding her ground. But there was a difference between pressing for accountability and turning an event into a personal performance. And right now, it was clear which one this was. A few cameras panned from Karoline to the reporter, capturing every shift in body language, every glance, every movement that could later be analyzed, dissected, and spun into a viral moment. Karoline inhaled through her nose, steadying herself. "I don't believe in wasting anyone's time," she said. "If you have a new question, I'll answer it. Otherwise, I'd like to give others a chance." The reporter smirked. "Sure. New question. Why is this administration so afraid of transparency?" A few quiet gasps. Some reporters scribbled furiously, recognizing the moment for what it was, an escalation, a direct provocation meant to bait Karoline into an emotional response. For the briefest second, her grip on the podium tightened. Then she let go, exhaling just slightly. Her smile was not warm, not the carefully curated diplomatic one she often used in press briefings, but something sharper, something that said, "I see exactly what you're trying to do." She took her time before responding. "Transparency," she said, "is exactly what this administration stands for. But what you're doing isn't about transparency, it's about theatrics." The words landed like a hammer. The smirk on the reporter's face faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Another journalist, one seated closer to the back, cleared his throat as if trying to redirect the conversation. "Karoline, if I could..." But again, the same voice interrupted. "So, you're dismissing valid concerns as theatrics?" The cameras caught everything. The slight tilt of Karoline's head, the way the other journalists shifted in their seats, some clearly frustrated that the event had been hijacked. A veteran journalist, someone who had been covering politics for decades, leaned back and muttered to a colleague, "This isn't journalism. This is performance art." But the reporter didn't care. She knew exactly what she was doing. The longer she kept this going, the more likely it was to go viral. A confrontation like this, it was gold for social media. Karoline saw it too. She had a choice: engage and give the moment more fuel, or shut it down entirely. She sighed, finally looking toward security at the side of the room. She didn't have to say anything. The shift in her gaze was enough. The room tensed. Everyone knew what that meant. This was no longer just a press briefing. It was about to escalate into something much bigger. The tension in the room continued to mount, thickening like an approaching storm as the exchange between Karoline Leavitt and the reporter refused to fade. Karoline had already answered the question, or at least she had provided a response that any seasoned journalist would recognize as a firm yet diplomatic attempt to move the discussion forward. But the reporter wasn't interested in moving on. She was playing a different game, one where winning wasn't about extracting information, but about creating a moment, a spectacle that would outlive the press conference itself. And right now, she was in full control of the stage. "So you're saying this administration has nothing to hide?" the reporter pressed, her voice slicing through the heavy air, loud enough to override the murmurs of other journalists who had already begun shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Karoline exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the podium before she released it again, making a conscious effort to remain composed. "That is not what I said," she responded evenly. "I have addressed your question, and I'm happy to continue discussing today's topics, but I will not be engaging in bad faith arguments." The smirk on the reporter's face widened just a fraction, a clear sign that she knew exactly what she was doing. "So you do think this is a bad faith argument?" she asked, her voice feigning innocence but carrying the unmistakable edge of provocation. Karoline didn't bite. "I think it's important to have a productive conversation," she said instead, scanning the room and directing her attention to another reporter who had been waiting patiently for a chance to ask a question. But before that journalist could even open their mouth, the same voice cut through again, this time sharper, more insistent. "Why is it so difficult for you to give a straight answer?" The energy in the room shifted further, tightening around them like a drawn bowstring. Other reporters exchanged knowing glances. Some were visibly annoyed, others watched with fascination, recognizing the unfolding drama for what it was. This wasn't about journalism anymore. It was about control, about one person refusing to relinquish the narrative. Karoline could feel it too, the way the attention of the room was no longer on the policy discussion, but on the confrontation itself. Every camera was trained on them now, recording every shift in expression, every flicker of emotion, every subtle sign of frustration that could later be dissected and spun into a headline. And that was exactly what the reporter wanted. Karoline inhaled deeply, keeping her voice even. "I've answered your question," she said again, her patience now measured but firm. "This press briefing is not about one person's agenda. If you'd like to discuss today's topics, I'm happy to engage, but I won't allow this briefing to be derailed." It was a statement of finality, an attempt to draw a boundary, to reestablish control. For a moment, it almost seemed like it would work. The reporter sat back slightly, her pen tapping against her notepad, her gaze locked onto Karoline as if deciding her next move. The air in the room was still, waiting. And then she made her choice. "So, for the record, you're refusing to answer?" The words were delivered not as a question, but as a setup, a well-crafted line designed to fuel the fire. A few quiet gasps echoed through the room. Some reporters scribbled furiously, recognizing the shift in tone. Karoline blinked once, slow and deliberate, the only visible sign that the remark had landed. She knew what the reporter was doing. She had seen it before, the strategic twisting of a conversation into an accusation, the manipulation of dialogue into a false dilemma. If she engaged, she would give the moment more power. If she ignored it, the narrative would be written for her anyway. The weight of the decision pressed against her, heavy but familiar. She had spent years navigating political spaces, understanding the mechanics of public perception. This was a game of optics as much as it was a battle of words, so she chose her next statement carefully. "I am refusing to play into this spectacle," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the air like a blade. "This briefing is meant to inform, not to entertain. If you have a legitimate question, ask it. If not, I'll move on." The words hung in the air, charged with finality. For a split second, even the reporter hesitated, as if recalibrating her approach, but she was too deep into the performance now, too committed to backpedal. She leaned forward, her voice dropping just slightly but carrying the same sharpness, right, because expecting transparency is a game. This time, the murmurs in the room were louder. A few journalists exchanged looks, some shaking their heads. A veteran journalist, someone who had been covering politics for decades, muttered under his breath, "This isn't journalism, this is theater." Karoline caught it, just barely, but she didn't react. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly, the only visible sign of acknowledgement. She saw the strategy now, clearer than ever. The reporter wasn't trying to extract answers. She was trying to frame a narrative, trying to turn herself into the story. The longer she kept pressing, the more she could claim that she was being silenced, that she was being shut down for simply doing her job. It was a calculated move, designed to go viral, and Karoline knew exactly how dangerous that could be. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her, not just from the reporter, but from the entire room. They were all waiting to see if she would snap, waiting to see if she would give in, waiting to see if she would give them the moment they were hoping for. But she wouldn't. Instead, she exhaled slowly, the smallest, most deliberate action, before adjusting the microphone and straightening her stance. "This briefing will continue," she said firmly, her voice carrying through the room with authority. "If you have real questions, I'll answer them. If not, I suggest we move forward." The challenge was issued, the line drawn. The reporter hesitated just briefly, as if weighing whether or not to push further, and then, in a move that was as predictable as it was calculated, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, and smirked. Got it, no comment. The cameras caught everything. The flicker of irritation in Karoline's expression, the way she pressed her lips together for just a fraction of a second before nodding toward another journalist, signaling that the exchange was over. But even as the next question was asked, even as the briefing continued, everyone in the room knew it wasn't really over. The moment had already been captured. The spin had already begun. And by the time Karoline stepped away from that podium, the narrative would already be written. Karoline Leavitt had been in enough press briefings to know when a reporter wasn't looking for an answer but for a spectacle. The persistent interruptions, the accusatory tone, the strategic reframing of her responses, it was all part of a calculated effort to make her, not the policies, the story. And she wasn't about to let that happen. She kept her stance firm, shoulders squared, hands steady on the podium as she took a measured breath, exhaling through her nose. The moment was at a tipping point and everyone in the room could feel it. The back and forth had drawn the attention of every journalist, some of whom had started as passive observers, but were now actively waiting to see how she would handle the escalating tension. The cameras, already locked onto her and the reporter, captured every glance, every shift in posture, every flicker of emotion that might later be dissected and broadcast across headlines. Karoline knew she was being tested, not just by the reporter, but by the room itself. She adjusted the microphone slightly, a small but deliberate movement before speaking again, her tone even, controlled. "I've answered your question," she reiterated, making it clear she wasn't going to let this continue any longer. "We are here to discuss today's topics. If you have a relevant question, I will answer it. Otherwise, I will be moving on." It was as firm as it was diplomatic, a clear signal that she wasn't shutting down the conversation, but refusing to be pulled into an endless cycle of provocation. But even as she spoke, she could see the reporter wasn't done. The woman leaned forward again, her smirk barely concealed, her pen tapping rhythmically against her notepad as she prepared for her next move. "So, just to be clear," she said, voice deliberately slow, as if setting up a trap, "are you refusing to answer because you can't, or because you don't want to?" The room tensed again. A few reporters inhaled sharply, recognizing the calculated nature of the question. It wasn't about policy anymore. It was a personal challenge, a way to frame Karoline's refusal to engage as an admission of guilt. Karoline remained still, her expression unreadable, though inside she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. If she ignored it, it would be spun as evasion. If she answered, it would only prolong the back and forth, giving the reporter exactly what she wanted. The silence stretched for a second too long, the anticipation thick enough to hold everyone in place. Finally, Karoline exhaled, her next words measured, deliberate. "I am refusing to play a game," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "This press conference is not about one person's agenda. It is about informing the public. If you have a real question, ask it. If not, I will move on." The response landed like a sharp blade, cutting through the tension with quiet authority. The smirk on the reporter's face faltered for just a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Right," she said, feigning amusement, "because expecting transparency is a game." A few murmurs rippled through the room, some reporters shifting in their seats, others exchanging subtle glances. A veteran journalist near the back shook his head slightly, muttering under his breath, "This isn't journalism. This is performance art." But the reporter wasn't interested in what her colleagues thought. She had already committed to the confrontation, and she wasn't about to back down now. Karoline saw it too, saw how the exchange had shifted from inquiry to spectacle. This wasn't about an answer. It was about control, about pushing the limits of the briefing until she either snapped or was forced to take action that could later be spun against her. She inhaled slowly, resisting the urge to let frustration seep into her tone. "Transparency," she said, her voice deliberate, "is exactly what this administration stands for. But transparency is about facts, not theatrics. What you're doing right now isn't about getting answers, it's about creating a moment." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since the exchange began, the energy in the room shifted slightly. A few reporters nodded, acknowledging the truth in what she was saying. The journalist closest to the commotion cleared his throat, trying to redirect the conversation. "Karoline, if I could ask..." But before he could even finish, the same voice interrupted, louder this time. So you're dismissing real concerns as theatrics. This time, it wasn't just a few murmurs. There was movement. Some reporters scribbled furiously. Others leaned back, visibly irritated that the briefing had been derailed. The tension was growing, evolving from mere discomfort to full-blown frustration. The camera zoomed in, capturing the way Karoline's jaw tightened just slightly, the flicker of exhaustion in her eyes, before she masked it with another composed breath. She could end this here. She could move on, ignore the next remark, force the conversation back into order. But she also knew that wouldn't be the end of it. The longer she let this continue, the more ammunition she was giving the reporter to frame the narrative in her favor. Karoline made her choice. She straightened, adjusting the microphone once more, then turned slightly, casting the briefest glance toward the security officer stationed near the entrance. It was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone not paying attention, but it was enough. The shift in her gaze alone sent a message, and the air in the room thickened in response. A few journalists tensed, recognizing what was about to happen. The security officer didn't move yet, but he didn't have to. The implication was clear. The reporter caught it too. Her smirk widened, as if daring Karoline to take the next step, to escalate the moment into something even bigger. "You're seriously doing this?" she asked, her voice lower now but still sharp enough to slice through the room. She was baiting her, pushing to see if she would actually go through with it. Karoline didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment settle. Then, in a voice that left no room for further debate, she said, "I think we're done here." It was a shockwave. A ripple of movement spread through the room, as journalists glanced at each other, processing what had just happened. The reporter let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. "Excuse me?" she said, tilting her head, eyes narrowing as if daring Karoline to repeat herself. But Karoline didn't need to. She had already made her position clear. "You've made it clear that you're not interested in a real discussion," she said, her tone unwavering. "You're looking for a headline? If you'd like to stay and listen to the rest of the press conference, you're welcome to. But I will not be answering any more of your questions." The words landed with finality. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Karoline remained still, her gaze locked on the reporter, unflinching. The next move was no longer hers, it was the reporter's. And whatever happened now, Karoline had already made her stance clear. She would not be pushed into a spectacle. She would not let the briefing be hijacked any longer. The tension in the room had reached its breaking point. The back and forth between Karoline Leavitt and the reporter had stretched beyond the usual press conference decorum and was now teetering on the edge of a full-blown confrontation. The air was thick with anticipation, a silence so dense it felt like the entire room was collectively holding its breath. Cameras were rolling, capturing every glance, every movement, every subtle shift in power. The other reporters, once merely observers, were now unwilling participants in the escalating scene, their expressions ranging from quiet intrigue to visible discomfort. No one wanted to be in the middle of a spectacle, but they all knew that was exactly what this moment had become. Karoline remained still, her hands resting firmly on the podium, her gaze locked onto the reporter who had refused to back down. She had tried to keep control, to steer the briefing back to its intended purpose, but it was clear that was no longer an option. The reporter was relentless, determined to push the exchange beyond a simple discussion into something viral, something that would make headlines before the press conference had even ended. And now, with the entire room watching, waiting, and recording, Karoline knew she had a choice. Continue engaging, which would only give the moment more fuel, or shut it down entirely. She made her decision. A subtle movement, her eyes flickering briefly toward the security officer stationed at the side of the room. She didn't need to say anything. The shift in her gaze was enough. A barely perceptible signal, but one that carried weight. Immediately, the atmosphere in the room changed. The energy snapped from tense anticipation to full-blown confrontation. The other reporters felt it, their bodies stiffening, their gazes darting between Karoline and the reporter, understanding what was about to happen. Some journalists gripped their pens a little tighter. Others adjusted their cameras, ensuring they didn't miss a single moment. The reporter noticed it too. Her smirk widened just slightly, as if daring Karoline to follow through. "You seriously doing this?" she asked, her voice lower now but still sharp, still edged with challenge. The security officer took a step forward, not aggressively, not even intrusively, but just enough to make his presence known. The meaning was clear: de-escalate or be removed. The silence in the room deepened. It was no longer just waiting. It was watching, recording, preparing for what came next. The reporter had a choice now, and she knew it. She could stand her ground, refuse to move, force security to physically escort her out. An image that would flood social media within minutes. A video clip that would be dissected and debated across political talk shows. Or she could get up, walk out on her own terms, and control the narrative in a different way. The calculation was clear in her eyes as she weighed her options. She went with the latter. Slowly she reached for her notepad, adjusting the strap of her bag as she rose to her feet. But she wasn't leaving quietly. "This is a disgrace," she muttered, just loud enough for the microphones to pick up. Then one final parting shot as she turned toward the exit. "You can kick me out, but you can't silence the truth." Karoline didn't respond. She remained exactly where she was, standing tall at the podium, her face unreadable. She had known this moment was coming from the second the reporter had decided to turn the briefing into a personal battleground. She had seen it before, the way narratives were crafted, the way one out-of-set clip could be twisted into something it wasn't. And she knew that within minutes, the headlines would be written. Press secretary removes journalist for asking tough questions. The door closed behind the reporter. It should have been over, but it wasn't. The silence that followed was not relief, it was uncertainty. The other journalists didn't know what to do, didn't know whether to continue as if nothing had happened or to address the elephant in the room. Some kept their eyes down, pretending to scribble notes. Others simply stared, waiting for Karoline's next move. From the back, a voice broke the silence. "Karoline, do you think this was the right decision?" She turned her attention toward the journalist who had spoken. "I think it was necessary," she said, her tone measured but firm. Another voice chimed in. "You don't think this will backfire?" She already knew it would. She knew that by the time she left the podium, the internet would already be flooded with clips, reactions, and outrage. She could already see the social media firestorm brewing, the commentators dissecting every second of the exchange, spinning it into the latest political controversy. But she also knew there was no winning in a situation like this. If she had let the reporter continue disrupting the briefing, she would have been accused of lacking control, of allowing the press room to descend into chaos. If she removed her, she would be accused of censorship, of suppressing the free press. It was a no-win situation, and she had chosen the lesser of two political evils. She straightened. "We're here to have discussions, not disruptions," she said simply. "If anyone else has real questions, I'm happy to answer them." A beat of hesitation, then, slowly, a hand went up. The press conference continued. But the real storm, the one waiting outside these four walls, had only just begun. The fallout began before Karoline Leavitt had even stepped away from the podium. By the time she exited the press briefing room, the clip had already started making its way across social media, political blogs, and news networks. The headlines were predictable, almost scripted. Press secretary shuts down journalist for asking tough questions. Free press under attack as reporter removed from briefing. Karoline Leavitt silences criticism in heated exchange. Each one framed the event according to its audience, some portraying her as a strong leader maintaining order, others painting her as an authoritarian figure suppressing free speech. The spin was immediate, and within minutes, the internet was ablaze with commentary from pundits, politicians, and everyday users who had already chosen their side. On conservative platforms, she was hailed as a professional who had skillfully managed a disruptive journalist looking for a viral moment. Supporters praised her composure, her refusal to be manipulated into an unnecessary argument, and her ability to maintain control over the room. Clips circulated showing how many times she had attempted to steer the conversation back to relevant policy discussions before finally shutting it down. "She handled it like a pro," one commentator said on a conservative news segment. "This wasn't journalism, it was grandstanding, and she saw right through it." Prominent conservative figures posted on social media defending her actions, arguing that she had upheld the integrity of the press briefing by refusing to let it devolve into a spectacle. But on mainstream media and progressive outlets, the narrative was very different. The reporter, who had walked out of the briefing after delivering her final parting words, wasted no time in shaping the story from her perspective. Within an hour, she had given multiple interviews, describing the experience as deeply troubling and a dangerous precedent for press freedom. On a primetime news slot, she sat across from a sympathetic anchor, shaking her head as she recounted the moment. "I was simply doing my job," she said, her voice measured but filled with just the right amount of indignation. "I was asking tough but necessary questions, and instead of addressing them, I was removed. That should worry everyone, regardless of political affiliation." The anchor nodded solemnly. "Did you feel threatened?" he asked, leaning in. The reporter sighed, shaking her head. "Not physically, no," she said. "But professionally, absolutely. This is about more than me. This is about the integrity of the press." The internet did what it always did, divided itself into warring factions. The hashtag silencing the press began trending within hours, pushed by journalists, activists, and celebrities who called the incident an attack on democracy. Clips of the exchange were clipped, edited, and repackaged, some cutting out Karoline's repeated attempts to answer before moving on, making it seem as though she had shut down the question immediately. Others removed the context of the entire briefing, focusing only on the security officer stepping forward, as if Karoline had called for the reporter's removal without cause. The outrage machine was fully operational. Her team monitored everything in real time, tracking which narratives were gaining traction. One of her aides hurried to her office, phone in hand, brows furrowed as she scrolled through the latest headlines. "Major outlets are running with it," she said. "Some are fair, just reporting what happened, but others—" She trailed off, shaking her head, as she flipped her screen around to show Karoline. The prominent news website had just posted an article titled, "Leavitt Shuts Down Press Freedom, Reporter Escorted Out for Speaking Truth to Power." Karoline let out a slow breath, pressing her lips together. "Speaking truth," she repeated, half a scoff, half a resigned laugh. She wasn't speaking truth, she was performing. The aide nodded. "Doesn't matter," she said. "That's not how it's being framed." Karoline had known this was coming. She had known it the moment she made the decision to stop the exchange, the moment she signaled security, the moment the reporter walked out with her last words designed for maximum effect. This was how it worked now. Cut the tension, cut out the context, slap on a dramatic headline, and let the outrage machine take care of the rest. And yet, despite knowing all of this, it was still frustrating to watch it unfold in real time, to see the story being twisted into something it wasn't. She didn't panic. She had been in politics long enough to know that narratives could shift, that the first wave of media coverage was never the final verdict. The real question wasn't whether people were angry, it was whether they were willing to look beyond the headlines to see the full picture. And that, she knew, was a battle worth fighting. Karoline Leavitt knew she had to act quickly. The backlash had already begun to spiral, and while she was no stranger to controversy, she understood the power of controlling the narrative before it became cemented in the public's mind. Sitting in her office, she watched as headlines continued to flood in, some framing her as a professional who had handled an unruly journalist with composure, others portraying her as an authoritarian figure silencing the press. Her aides moved frantically around the room, tracking media coverage, monitoring social media trends, and briefing her on the latest developments. "The conservative outlets are backing you," one of them said, glancing at their phone. "They're calling it a master class in handling media manipulation." "But the mainstream networks?" She hesitated before reading aloud a breaking news alert. "Karoline Leavitt removes reporter for asking tough questions. Chilling moment for free press." Karoline exhaled sharply. She had expected this. "And the White House?" she asked. Another aide looked up from her laptop. "They're keeping their distance. No official statement yet, but they're clearly watching how this unfolds before making a move." That was expected, too. In a media firestorm like this, even political allies were hesitant to pick a side too early. Karoline tapped her fingers against her desk, thinking through her options. The reporter had already made her rounds, appearing on multiple networks, framing herself as a victim of suppression. Her story was being repeated, amplified, and repackaged into a broader conversation about press freedom. A narrative Karoline knew was misleading, but effective. Fighting back with outrage would only add fuel to the fire. Instead, she needed to cut through the noise with something undeniable: the truth. "We need to release the full footage," she said, her voice firm. "No edits, no commentary. Just the raw exchange. Let people see exactly what happened." There was a brief pause before her aides nodded in agreement. It was the best move, one that would allow the facts to speak for themselves while undercutting the selectively edited clips that were already spreading. Within the hour, her team had the video ready to go. A simple, direct caption accompanied the post. "Watch for yourself. The full exchange between Karoline Leavitt and the reporter at today's press briefing. No dramatic claims, no defensive rhetoric, just transparency." As the video started gaining traction, the reactions were immediate. Some who had initially bought into the journalist's version of events watched the full clip and began to question the narrative. Others doubled down, unwilling to shift their stance. Conservative voices praised the release, arguing it exposed how the reporter had deliberately tried to hijack the briefing for her own agenda. Meanwhile, mainstream outlets hesitated. The full footage complicated their framing, making it harder to sell the idea that Karoline had simply shut down a tough question without cause. Karoline leaned back in her chair, watching as the numbers on the video climbed. The battle wasn't over, but at least now the truth was out there. The question was, who would believe it? The fallout from the press conference had settled into two competing narratives, each one shaped not by objective truth, but by ideological allegiance. Karoline Leavitt understood this better than most. She had spent years in politics, witnessing firsthand how the modern media landscape functioned. It was no longer about reporting facts. It was about crafting narratives, about seizing moments that could be repackaged for viral consumption. What had happened in that briefing room wasn't just a difficult exchange between a press secretary and a reporter. It had become a case study in how journalism and activism had become nearly indistinguishable in the digital age. The reporter who had challenged her was never looking for an answer. She had been looking for a moment, a confrontation, a clip that could be edited, framed, and weaponized for engagement, and she had succeeded, at least in part. Within hours of the exchange, her face was on every major news network, recounting her so-called silencing, painting herself as a crusader for press freedom rather than an instigator who had refused to adhere to the basic rules of a professional briefing. The term chilling effect had been thrown around liberally, as if Karoline's refusal to indulge an intentionally disruptive line of questioning was a blow to democracy itself. Karoline knew better. She had watched the full, unedited footage more than once, not because she needed to justify her decision, she stood by every word she had said, but because she wanted to analyze how a single moment could be so drastically manipulated depending on who was telling the story. Some networks cut the clip right as she signaled to security, omitting the repeated attempts she had made to move the discussion forward. Others left out the part where the reporter had ignored protocol, continuing to interrupt and disrupt even after being warned multiple times. And then there were the social media clips, carefully edited to evoke maximum outrage, fading out the moment Karoline looked towards security, making it seem as though she had removed the journalist at the first sign of discomfort. It was in every way an orchestrated effort to control the perception of what had happened. It was not about truth, it was about influence. The irony, of course, was that this manipulation was coming from the very institutions that claimed to uphold transparency and accountability. But the reality of modern journalism was that it was no longer purely about informing the public. It was about engagement, clicks, and shaping public perception. Controversy drove traffic. Outrage fueled ratings, and figures like the reporter knew how to play that game expertly. She had used the moment to elevate herself, to insert her name into the broader cultural debate, positioning herself as a fighter for democracy rather than an opportunist who had deliberately provoked a response. The veteran journalists who had been in that briefing room saw through it. Some had even quietly admitted it, though few would ever say so publicly. But the newer generation of media figures, the ones who viewed their jobs as activism rather than reporting, embraced the narrative without question. Karoline knew this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger shift in the way media operated in the digital age. She wasn't naive. She knew that releasing the full footage wouldn't magically undo the damage. People didn't seek out full context anymore. They wanted quick sound bites that reinforced their existing beliefs. Those who wanted to believe she had silenced a journalist would never watch the entire clip, just as those who supported her would only share the parts that vindicated her. Truth had become secondary to perception. The question was no longer what actually happened, but what version of the story do you believe? That was the new battleground. As she sat in her office, watching pundits argue over whether she had overstepped or simply maintained order, she realized that this incident wouldn't be remembered for what it actually was, a press secretary handling a disruptive journalist, but for what people wanted it to be. The reporter would ride the wave of attention, securing guest appearances, writing op-eds, and perhaps even landing a book deal on the supposed suppression of the press. Meanwhile, Karoline would move on to the next press briefing, knowing that this wouldn't be the last time she found herself at the center of a manufactured controversy. The cycle would repeat, as it always did. She took a deep breath, glancing at the notification on her phone. Her team had just posted the full footage across official channels. The numbers were climbing, people were watching, but she knew that in the long run, it wouldn't change much. The people who valued truth over sensationalism would see it for what it was. The rest? They had already made up their minds. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't about one press conference, it was about something bigger. The state of journalism, the erosion of objectivity, the growing chasm between truth and perception. And in a world where narratives mattered more than facts, the real question wasn't whether she had handled the situation correctly, it was whether the truth even mattered at all. The events surrounding Karoline Leavitt's press briefing reveal a deeper truth about modern communication, one that resonates far beyond politics or media. In today's world, perception often holds more weight than reality. Information is no longer consumed with patience and discernment. Instead, it is shaped, packaged, and filtered to fit pre-existing narratives. For those who have lived through decades of societal change, this shift is especially noticeable. There was once a time when truth was something to be pursued, when journalism was about informing rather than influencing. Now, however, we see how easily facts can be distorted, how quickly outrage replaces rational discussion, and how the loudest voices often drown out the most reasonable ones. This serves as a reminder that wisdom comes not from reacting to every piece of information at face value, but from pausing, questioning, and seeking full context. In our own lives, we encounter situations where people will twist words, manipulate events, or create their own version of reality. The lesson here is not just about media literacy, but about personal integrity. When faced with criticism, we must ask ourselves, are we reacting emotionally, or are we standing firm in our values? True strength is found in composure, in knowing when to speak and when to let the truth reveal itself over time. Just as Karoline refused to be baited into a spectacle, we too must choose our battles wisely, understanding that not every challenge requires an immediate response. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is to remain steadfast, knowing that truth, even in a world of noise, will always find a way to surface.